In Toronto, there are two types of properties. There are properties that are exempt from the rent increase guidelines, and there are properties that are not exempt from the rent increase guidelines. So if the property that you're living in was constructed after November 15th, 2018, essentially your landlord could adjust your rent by whatever they feel brings it up to market rent. So it could be $500, it could be $700, it could be $1,000. And there are no sort of guardrails in place to control that. If it was built before then, you are subject to the rent increase guidelines, and so is your landlord. So they would only be able to increase your rent by the amount that's set out by the Ontario government. For 2025, that amount is 2.5%. So it's not going to be an uncomfortable increase. Ideally, it'll just be that incremental increase to keep it in line with inflation. Ideally, your landlord is responding to your requests immediately, especially if they are emergencies, which is essentially loss of heat, loss of water, or loss of hot water, loss of power, flood. You want a response immediately to understand that they know, first of all, that their property is in a situation that could result in it becoming damaged. So you have an obligation as a tenant to report those things. So you want that confirmation that they've received your communication. And then of course, you also want to understand the timelines and the associated schedule for getting that restored. Not without the written confirmation and approval of the landlord. If you're doing a renovation, would probably almost never be approved, simply because your landlord is going to want to have their own contractors doing that kind of work. But if you have things that you want to do that are minor, like painting the walls or hanging paintings and things like that, I would simply ask and mention to them, when you do leave the property, you're going to restore it back to the condition that you found it in. As long as your landlord understands that that's your intention and that you're not simply going to paint all of the walls a dark color and then leave, and the repainting bill will be on your landlord, I think they'll likely approve it. But you want to absolutely have that conversation ahead of time. There are a number of reasons why a landlord might bring an application to the Landlord and Tenant Board to have a tenant evicted. A landlord can't just arbitrarily say, hey, you're evicted. There's a process involved, and that process is issuing the tenant a notice, outlining their behavior, giving them a timeline to resolve that behavior or stop that behavior, and then failing that, there will be another notice that says, now we're going to go to the Landlord and Tenant Board on this date. You would then be expected to go and present your case, your landlord will present theirs, and then an adjudicator again will decide whether they feel you should be evicted or not as the tenant. That's the process. The landlord can't just say, hey, you're evicted. It has to go through the Landlord and Tenant Board, and an adjudicator will issue a directive. The most common reason for an eviction is non-payment of rent. The second one is impacting the reasonable enjoyment of the other people in the building. And the third is causing damage to the space. If you feel as though any of the notices that you're ever given throughout your tenancy are served in bad faith, you can issue or file, for a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And again, an adjudicator is going to look at everything and make a decision.